Welcome everybody to tonight's Immunisation Coalition webinar on COVID-19, an update in 2023. My name is Andrew Minton. I work for the Immunisation Coalition. I'm responsible for the development of medical education for healthcare professionals. As a bit of a plug to what we've been doing in the last 3 months, please visit our website. There are some CPD and non-CPD accredited webinars online on demand, of which the Japanese encephalitis webinar, which was run yesterday or last night, will be online as of next week, and that is CPD accredited for GPs. COVID-19 is still very relevant subject to discuss, even though the pandemic is largely over. Pending the next pandemic. We have accepted to live with COVID-19 now and understand it more over the last 2 to 3 years. We're feeling quite comfortable that vaccines are available and we are vaccinated to some degree. Before I start tonight's webinar, I just want to give you a few statistics which will be relevant to our speaker tonight or his presentation. I looked on the NNDSS website and there was some very interesting information, and it's a reason why we should stay vigilant and consider the population at large. So looking at the NNDSS data and just looking as a bit of a snapshot for the last week, we've averaged 4,500 cases per day for the last week. Importantly, that is actually decreasing year to date, so that's a good thing. But we head into the winter season, so we yet to see what that will look like as notifiable cases. Unfortunately, last week, for the week, we had 55 patients admitted to the ICU, and there were 89 deaths. So COVID is still about, and vaccination remains paramount. So before we start tonight's webinar, I'd like to pay tribute to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Immunisation Coalition acknowledges the traditional custodians of this country and their connections to land, sea, and the community. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and future, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Presenting tonight, we're lucky actually to have him. He's an expert in COVID-19 and an expert in influenza as well, is Professor Gary Groman. He'll be speaking for around 40 minutes, which leaves us about 15 minutes for question and answers. As usual, when you ask your questions, please ask them through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we could have a bit of fun here. If you haven't asked a question before for whatever reason, please have a go. So I'll be looking for questions from first timers, and I guess we could abbreviate the question or the intent for have a go as HAG. So if you put in the question HAG beforehand, which is have a go, I will look for those and I will try and prioritize those questions. So have a go. Tonight's presentation will be recorded, so all participants will automatically be on mute, and this presentation will be available online on our website by about next Wednesday. So I would now like to introduce our speaker. His name is Professor Gary Groman. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Sydney. He is also a board member and director of the Immunisation Coalition. He holds several consultancy posts with societies and organizations, of which include, and Gary, you can actually forward the next slide, sorry, the WHO, biointellect, and environmental pathogens, who are based in Canberra. His interests as a virologist include virology, vaccination and control of infectious diseases, pandemic planning for COVID-19 and influenza, environmental virology, gastrointestinal viruses, and virus manufacturing. So without delay, I'll hand over to Gary to take us through what is an important and very relevant topic, COVID-19, a 2023 update. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that introduction. And I've been asked tonight to give an overview of COVID-19 and where we are now, particularly aimed at our general practitioners and nurses and pharmacists and so on, and those other key frontline workers. So I think the slide was actually yours, Andrew, so I'm not sure if you want to make a quick comment on that one. I think there's a poll that hopefully everyone will be able to fill out.
Yes, and that poll is open. If people could just nominate which profession is in that poll they're associated with. Thank you.
Okay, the nurses are winning at the moment. All right, so I think that's probably it, is it? So we've got 52% nurses and 26% GPs, and then some pharmacists and other. Great, well, thank you for that. Well, there's some good news. After 3 years of WHO declaring SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 a fake, a public health emergency of international concern, a few days ago, it withdrew that designation and declared that the global emergency is over. The committee that advised the Director General to do this based it on quite a bit of information, and in particular, I suppose the death rate was key because it dropped significantly from 100,000 per week in January 2021 down to 3,500 per week in April 2023 globally. WHO has also made it clear that we should not let down our guard. We should not dismantle the systems that have been built or send the message to people that COVID-19 is nothing to worry about. It also made the comment that 13 billion vaccine doses have been given around the world, but these have not reached many of the LIMC countries, the low and middle income countries. So the emergency may have ended, but the threat is still there, to quote them, to quote the Director General. And they also said that in most cases, pandemics truly end when the next pandemic begins. Coming with those recommendations were 7 main headings. The first one was that encouraging all countries to sustain national capacity gains and prepare for future events. I think the important thing here is to avoid the occurrence of a cycle of panic and neglect. So we've been through the cycle of panic. We've been very fortunate to have the miracle of messenger RNA vaccines and other vaccines that have come our way to date, the viral vector vaccines as well, and now more recently the protein vaccines have all been incredibly important. And with the withdrawal of the fake, we have to be careful not to fall into a cycle of neglect, or as Andrew said earlier, in accepting to live with the virus, we must make sure that we don't neglect all the good work that's been done, whether it's pharmaceutical or vaccines or through drugs or through simple isolation and the wearing of masks and so on, which shows individual responsibility. And all that needs to be furthered in a way rather than fall into a cycle of neglect, as we saw happen, in fact, after the 2009-10 pandemic with influenza. They've also advised countries to integrate COVID vaccination into life course vaccination programs. And that makes sense, particularly for the vulnerable and the elderly, those over 65. This does make sense, and I'm sure many countries will adopt this. They've encouraged people to bring together information from diverse pathogen surveillance data. At the moment, really, it's all over the place. There are different groups that collect data for one virus or another virus, but there's no comprehensive bringing together of information for these diverse pathogens, and that would include genetic information. They've encouraged.
I'll just let you beforehand.
They've also encouraged regulatory authorities to come together and strengthen their support for each other, and in particular for long-term authorization, so that availability and supply is available for vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. They've asked states to continue to work with communities to achieve strong and resilient and inclusive risk communications. Often community engagement has been hampered by what can be called the infodemic. And by infodemic, I mean social media and misinformation that's coming through those platforms. They've asked states to continue to lift international travel health measures for COVID-19 based on risk assessment. So there's no need anymore that countries should require any proof of vaccination as a prerequisite for international travel. And they've also asked for continuous support for research and vaccines that reduce transmission. That's an area where we've really failed at with vaccines to date. They don't reduce transmission for any significant period of time, if at all. And I've put in brackets myself, we should also keep an eye on therapeutics and diagnostics tests and improve those and make sure that when the next pandemic comes, that these are also available and research needs to continue there. So what do we know? Where are we now? It's good to review some of this just very briefly. We know that the current Omicron is highly infectious and dominating globally. We know there'll be more waves to come of subvariants, but we haven't seen a new major variant like alpha, beta, gamma, or delta for over a year and a half now. We know it spreads efficiently in close community settings, particularly where there's poor natural ventilation. We know that the severity of disease is diminishing over time, as we can see with the death rate. We know that drugs like ivermectin, hydrochloroquine, and others are not effective treatments, and in fact are likely to cause increased risk of adverse events to recipients. We know that severe community restrictions are not effective in halting disease. They are certainly effective for the first 6 to 10 weeks, while diagnostic tests and antiviral drugs and vaccines are initiated. But after that, they really have a counter effect. And this is because of asymptomatic carriers and people with mild illness spreading the virus easily in the community. But of course, it is essential in the initial stages of a pandemic to protect health services from being overwhelmed, but ultimately mandates are in fact counterproductive. We know we need at least 3 doses of vaccine. Current vaccines don't stop transmission. We know that heterologous vaccination gives better protection, and we know that hybrid gives the best vaccine or heterologous vaccination plus the natural infection. And yes, adverse events do occur. All vaccines give adverse events, but severe adverse events are in fact rare, probably somewhere 1 to 50 to 100,000, depending on the data you read and how you'd like to interpret it, but they are rare. But we also know that men in particular under the age of 30 have a higher risk of myocarditis and pericarditis from mRNA vaccines. And there's a little bit of evidence coming through for the protein vaccines, which I'll talk about later, but it does need confirmation. We know that long COVID is real, but we also know that the vast majority of cases resolve within a year, but our next challenge is going to be long COVID, that's for sure. We know that antiviral drugs and treatments are reasonably effective if given within the first 24 hours of diagnosis, if there are no contraindications. And it does take a GP assessment of this because all patients are different, and some of these drugs do have contraindications depending on other medications that people are taking. We know that PCR tests are the most accurate and that RAT tests are useful, but only if you're symptomatic. The sensitivity of rat tests seems to be markedly diminishing depending on a number of things. One, the test; two, the virus; three, the way it's used. But there are issues around sensitivity. There are issues around home use. In other words, it being done properly. There's no reporting anymore of rat tests, so we can't collect the data and really understand how useful they are. And we need responsibility. In other words, people who are positive do need to isolate or at least understand that they can transmit the virus to other people. But with cost of living pressures and so on, people seem to be going to work anyway. And I believe that rat tests are inadvertently helping virus spread. There are significant costs to the community in form of mental health and so on. We know that, affecting economic activity ultimately. And there still remains a need for vision and a unified action across our 6 states and 2 territories. So there is a single authoritative, independent health institution for the next novel pandemic threat. At the moment, I think we've had 6 states and 2 territories all basically doing their own thing, which I think has been very unfortunate and has led to many consequences for all those constituents. And there will be another pandemic. We will get 3 to 4 per century. We haven't seen a coronavirus before, we think, unless there was one in 1895, but we've certainly seen quite a bit of influenza. So what do we know? We know that boosters are important, and there's benefit for a booster for healthy people under the age of 50 is actually quite questionable. Neither WHO nor ATAGI support it. But the use of mRNA vaccine in healthy persons under 30 is in fact not done in some European countries. But of course, they are very important for the vulnerable, people with underlying conditions, and also those of people over 65. The difficulty with the mRNA for healthy people is it's not clear that the benefits actually outweigh the risks. So there's this possibility, albeit rare, of myocarditis and so on, and WHO have made a very clear statement. Data to support an additional dose for healthy younger populations simply isn't there really. And preliminary data suggests that in younger people, the benefit's quite marginal. So where are we now? The global snapshot from WHO a few days ago shows 765 million confirmed cases, clearly an underestimate. Everybody thinks it's probably more like 2 billion, maybe even higher when you take into account asymptomatic infection. Deaths, 6.9 million globally. This is probably an overestimate because there are quite a lot of people who would have died with COVID rather than because of COVID. We also know that over 13 billion vaccine doses have been administered, but sadly not in LMIC countries, more so in developed nations. And that is yet another fault in our system globally. In Australia, we've seen 11 million confirmed cases, again an underestimate, and 20,000 or so deaths. The case fatality rate's actually incredibly low. I've just compared Australia to the UK, and the case fatality rate is well below 1%, probably below 0.05% when you take it all into account. So we're dealing with a virus that probably has a case fatality rate even lower than influenza. But Australia is a hotspot. On the heat map on the left, we can see that Australia is in a very dark colour there, showing that we have one of the highest rates of transmission in the world per capita, but we have one of the lowest death rates in the world. And in terms of vaccines administered, again, the heat map showing Australia quite dark there, and we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. So we've been very lucky with the death rate and also having vaccines available. Seroprevalence is interesting to look at. This is data from Public Health England, and it shows that every single age group does have nearly 80 to 90%, approaching 100%, have got antibodies, undoubtedly due to vaccination in part, but also asymptomatic infection. And if you look at children, which is on the next slide, again from Public Health England, one can see for the unvaccinated, for primary school students, over 80% of them had antibodies. due to infection, either symptomatically or asymptomatically. And when we look at secondary school students, that's approaching 100%. In the dark blue, they're unvaccinated. So we can see that in the UK, where the data is quite good on seroprevalence, that this virus has spread asymptomatically quite well. Nearly everybody has antibodies to it. Australian seroprevalence data is similar. So from Kirby, anti-spike antibodies are very high, 98% across all jurisdictions. Importantly, good data on the anti-nuclear capsid seroprevalence, highest among donors between 18 and 29 at 27%, and then declining within increasing age. And it's these spike antibodies that are quite important to measure, and we've seen NCIRS do the same thing, and they've shown 64% of under 19-year-olds have been infected with COVID-19 because these antibodies show recent infection. So where are we with Omicron? We've got nothing but subvariants been emerging now for 18 months, and these subvariants come and go, of course. And at the moment, we've got XBB 1.5 and 1.16, given these names of Kraken and Arcturus, which sound more like a Hollywood movie than what's going on. I guess virologists just call it 1.5 or 1.16. And these will come and go. CH1 and some others are also emerging now. And we'll see these disappear in time. And my message to everyone is there really is a need to stop catastrophizing the appearance of every subvariant and every mutation that occurs. We haven't got a new variant yet, something that's absolutely going to escape the immunity produced by the current vaccines. We have a constantly changing scene virologically. There will be more waves, there will be more iterations of this virus. And even the latest data from China, where a cycle of fears seem to emerge from people around the world, these viruses continue to resemble known circulating variants. There's nothing new there. The only thing that's been new really is with Arcturus 1.16. There has been conjunctivitis noted in India. And this is the first time this has been described consistently. But we have known that these viruses can be transmitted by the ocular route as well. So 1.16 is just one of over 600 Omicron subvariants. It originated in India. It's a reassortment of 2.10 and BA 2.75, very closely related to 1.5. It is the most contagious subvariant. So far, it's appeared in 34 countries. 10% of isolations in the US can cause conjunctivitis. The fear is that it might recombine with other viruses. That may happen, but we'll probably just get another iteration of Omicron. And certainly I don't believe there's any cause for concern at this stage. The clinical course the clinical course is important to note. We see in the pre-symptomatic phase, first stages of viral replication. Then with mild symptomatic disease, we see innate immune responses. Then we see cellular responses. But if these innate responses are poor, excuse me, it often leads to severe disease. Then there are cellular responses. And if they're good, then it generally leads to mild disease, and then humoral responses, and then recovery. And this is a normal course for event. We can have antivirals at this early stage. We've got immunomodulators a bit later. We've got prophylactic antibodies that could be actually used for contacts. And we have therapeutic antibodies as well. Generally monoclonal antibodies that have been very successful. We have PCR tests, and the arrow is missing here, but they can detect virus for about 21 days. But the rat test generally only in the mild symptomatic phase of disease, not pre-symptomatic. And they generally are positive for about 7 days, sometimes a bit longer. So the transmission and life cycle of the virus is fairly straightforward. So so the virus enters the cell and replicates. There are number 2, it takes a pretty standard course. Then it fuses with the vesicle RNA is released, and the virus replicates and is released from the cell, ingested by antigen-presenting cells, and then we get the usual responses, cellular and humoral immune responses. So there's nothing terribly unusual about that in terms of a way a virus would replicate. The clinical symptoms are highly variable. Many viral positive individuals are in fact asymptomatic or only have minor cold symptoms. Fever, dry and persistent cough, fatigue, loss of smell and appetite are common. Headaches, sore throat, myalgia, rigors, intestinal discomfort, ocular manifestations have also been described in many patients. Severe symptoms leading to hospitalization progress often to hypoxia, respiratory distress, which requires oxygen and ventilator support, and that's most prevalent in the elderly and people with underlying comorbidities. And there's this unusual presentation in children, similar to Kawasaki disease, multi-system inflammatory disease in children that's been described. It's a non-purulent conjunctivitis and a rash, mucosal changes, swollen extremities, and a high proportion of hypertension. And then there are more serious things like multifocal pathogenesis can occur, cytokine storm can occur, and interestingly, patients with pre-existing neuromuscular conditions get an exacerbation of degenerative conditions. Autoimmune conditions can arise like GBS, but there can be virus reactivation, particularly from the herpes group, which can cause Bell's palsy, for example, and shingles. But also reactivation of enteroviruses and HTLVs has also been described. The immunological landscape is really quite varied because this virus can affect all systems, the GI system, respiratory, it's neurotropic as well, it causes myositis and so on. But in general, there's disruption of the ACE2 epithelium that can lead to dysfunctional type 1 IFN responses and myeloid hyperinflammation, and cytokine-driven hyperinflammation, then lymphopenia. It can also go straight to lymphoid organ failure, and then lymphopenia are just 2 ways that this virus can affect human beings. So what about long COVID? This is a very difficult area at the moment because it lacks true definition, and data, although slowly accumulating, is also in many ways too varied to really make too many conclusions. But WHO have provided a definition: the continuation or development of new symptoms after 3 months after the initial infection, and with these symptoms lasting for at least 2 months with no other explanation. Symptoms are generally fatigue, shortness of breath, and cognitive dysfunction. And according to WHO, 10 to 20% of people can be affected, which is quite high. And WHO Europe have said that more than 17 million people across the EU have experienced long COVID during the first 2 years of the pandemic. In the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare review, they estimate 5 to 10% of Australians have got long COVID. The key risk factors are having obviously the illness first, a comorbidity, being female, and being in a mid-adult age group are all key risk factors. That's where most of our cases are. And they also said that 2 COVID vaccination doses are associated with a 13 to 47% lower risk of symptoms persisting beyond 4 weeks. It goes by various names in the literature: post-COVID condition, long COVID, long haul COVID, post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, PASC. Obviously, anyone who gets COVID can have long-term effects. Of course, the only way not to get long COVID is not to get COVID in the first place. Returning or ongoing system of more than 4 weeks is a definition by many people, not the WHO. Many other symptoms can be reported: fatigue, symptoms getting worse after physical or mental effort, recurrent fever, difficulty breathing, and cough. Now, more rarely we get these neurological symptoms: joint and muscle pain, heart symptoms, generally palpitations or pain in the heart, pericarditis, digestive symptoms, blood clots, and vascular issues, rash, changes in the menstrual cycle, reactivation of herpes virus, particularly shingles, GBS, and Bell's palsy. There are these long-term effects, as I mentioned earlier, organ damage and inflammation and multi-system inflammatory syndrome. And risk factors described by other papers are more common in adults than in children and teens. 20% of adults have long-term effects. And it's believed that, I've done that one, and difficulty in breathing and shortness of breath. So I seem to have jumped a slide here. So more severe illness, particularly if you've been hospitalized or intensive care. Interesting research out of the CDC, COVID causing brain abnormalities 6 months after symptoms have gone, changes in the brain stem and frontal lobe areas of the brain associated with fatigue and headaches, depression and cognitive issues. They use a special MRI to detect and monitor neurological conditions such as microbleeds, vascular malformations, brain tumours and stroke. And there's a lot more work to be done in these areas, obviously. What vaccines do we have? We're familiar with the AstraZeneca, Moderna, Novavax and Pfizer. AstraZeneca is not available anymore, but they're all available for initial courses and also as booster doses. As I mentioned earlier, heterologous vaccine seems to be better than homologous, and hybrid vaccination is the best of all. And we have these, acceptable and comparable immunogenicity, efficacy, and effectiveness for all these vaccines. Most studies done in 30 to 40,000, which gives us a 1 in 10,000 chance of seeing a serious adverse event, probably why we didn't see myocarditis in the initial studies. Now we've seen a number of vaccines are in development now for combination vaccines, and these are coming. And also we've had new vaccines registered by Moderna and Pfizer, and Novavax are in a phase 3 program with their vaccine. Most of these are bivalent vaccines. Some of them target BA.4/5, some of them Beta and Delta, some of them are targeting the original Wuhan strain and Delta, depending on the approach. Some companies, notably here Moderna, are looking at all 3 vaccines, if you include RSV, so COVID, flu and RSV, as they're looking at candidates there. So it will be a kind of an adult pan respiratory candidate vaccine. Of course, as many of you know, recently a protein RSV vaccine was registered by the FDA. So new vaccines are certainly on the horizon and coming, whether they're protein or these mRNA vaccines. So ATAGI booster advice, I think, is quite clear. For people at risk, it's not recommended for under 5. For young adults to consider, because there is that risk from mRNA and possibly protein for myocarditis, and it is recommended for adults and those over 65 who have risk conditions. And those without risk factors, it's not recommended, but adults can consider receiving it, and those over 65, it is recommended. And there's a long list of at risk, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people over 50, those that are immunocompromised, and the people with a disability. So how good are bivalents? Well, as far as I'm concerned, as being formerly in a regulatory authority and also working for WHO in a similar area, frankly, immunogenicity isn't everything. And there's a problem of imprinting or original antigenic sin, where you get boosting of antibody to other strains. So we do have various combinations, as I mentioned, but the data tells me that mRNA vaccines with a booster have a 36% efficacy at 76 days after receiving a booster, although it's a lot more prior to that. So how long do they last? Not particularly long, it would appear to me from the data so far. 4th and 5th dose boosters are actually not recommended for healthy people anyway. And the mRNA risk benefit for those under 30 is actually quite poor, and there's little protection, if any, against all age groups by the mRNA. So what does the TGA tell us? TGA shows very low numbers of adverse events being reported to the TGA. We have to take some of this data with a grain of salt, but it's real data and it's there, so it's good to look at. So very, very few reports, in fact, coming in, given the total doses administered to the TGA. But this is really superficial data. We don't capture it all. We just capture what's been reported to the TGA. The rare side effects we're familiar with. Unfortunately, we've seen 14 deaths, 13 related to the AstraZeneca vaccine and 1 to Spikevax. But I find it interesting to look at the FDA, which has a larger and more accurate reports than what's been reported unsolicited to the TGA. So they've got 42,000 report snapshots from time to time, showing 2.5% of people receiving mRNA have cardiac issues, 24% have GI issues, and 17% fatigue. Now, you do have to tease that out a bit and see how serious they are. But nevertheless, as a snapshot, I think it gives a more accurate indication of what's going on with these vaccines and what people are reporting. In Canberra, we had a protest, and this was just last Sunday, and around the lake, there were thousands of these posters of people talking about vaccine injuries. And as we know, there's now class actions going on in protests in various parts of Australia and class action in Queensland. I suspect we'll see more of this as thousands and thousands more people come to talk about whatever vaccine injury they believe they have. TGA can't investigate everything, that's understandable, and neither can GPs and frontline workers. So people are now starting to document and record some of the injuries they believe they've had, and it will be interesting to see where this ends up. But somehow we've missed these people. I'm not sure how, but we've somehow missed these people in the various safety databases that we have. And there is certainly, I believe, a need to collect this data to really understand the picture on vaccine injury and adverse events. Just a quick word on treatments. We have various antivirals, antibody treatments, particularly monoclonal antibodies have been quite successful in my view. Anticoagulants, dexamethasone and corticosteroids, oxygen, some success with statins, and micronutrients as well seem to be useful if there's a deficiency. The Evishield is useful for the pre-exposure prevention of COVID-19. Stravovimab has been particularly useful as well within the first 5 days of symptoms. Remdesivir, as we know, has been useful and used in hospitals. In adults, molnupiravir should no longer routinely be given, but was useful in its day, I guess, but now the recommendation from the Department of Health and ATAGI is that it should not be given any longer. Paxlovid should be given, particularly in adult patients in high-risk groups who are at increased risk of hospitalisation and death because it's more efficacious than molnupiravir. But I think we have to understand that all antivirals do have contraindications, and the TGA website has a very long list, and it does require an important meeting between patient and GP, because only the GP really knows what other drugs somebody particularly over 65 might be on, and it's important there are no contraindications. But personally, I believe Paxlovid should be more available given GP advice. So currently, people over 70, regardless of risk factors, with or without symptoms, are eligible to receive Paxlovid. 50 years and older with 2 additional risk factors, First Nations persons, and people 18 years or older that are moderately to severe immunocompromised. But I believe it should be more available than that if we are to control hospitalizations and deaths more effectively. Well, we're still left with a lot of critical questions. It is definitely a global problem. It's not just a local problem. COVID will infect and reinfect. We don't know if there'll be another major variant or not, but there's no evidence to suggest that there will be at this stage. We do need to transition to and manage a steady state infection in the community of low-level transmission. There's no doubt about that. Will the virus mutate and force new vaccines to be made? Probably yes, and we'll have new vaccines, I would hope, every 6 to 12 months at least. What are the correlates of protection? Research still needs to happen there. We still don't really know. What vaccines will prevent transmission? None at the moment. And we need to do the research to find vaccines that will, and it's only then we'll be able to get really on top of this pandemic. And so at the moment, we'll be left with endless boosters for the vulnerable, at least. And we also need community acceptance of vaccines that might not be optimal, particularly if there are going to be a number of people getting vaccine injury or further sequelae from taking a vaccine. Will vaccines prevent severe disease and hospitalizations? Yes, they will. But the vaccine at the same time is also attenuating. So the virus itself, through mutation, is less likely without vaccines, in fact, to result in fewer hospitalizations and fewer people with severe disease. Should masks still be worn? Well, the evidence for masks stopping transmission isn't that great, in fact. But I think for people that are vulnerable and older, they should probably wear masks in close spaces. I don't know that they should return, particularly with Omicron, but I think there's an argument for closed spaces with poor ventilation or in institutions that there is a need, I think, to wear masks, not necessarily to stop you from getting an infection, but to stop the asymptomatic carrier from spreading it into the atmosphere. So we still need to be very proactive, not just reactive as we have been, and we have the chance now, particularly as the fake is being declared, the emergency's been declared to be over. We absolutely have to concentrate on education and education and education, surveillance, having tests available that are getting better and better, having vaccines available that are getting better, and treatments. I think if we can have treatments available prior to a vaccine for the next pandemic, we will be well and truly ahead of the game. And that to me is one of the most important things. So second generation vaccines are absolutely needed and they're coming. There's good work out of Queensland with the new clamp technology. There's good work out of the Doherty with the new protein vaccine and the new mRNA vaccine, all in trials, and we look forward to those. Vaccines must have improved safety profiles. That's something we can't drop the ball on. We need to make sure our vaccines are safe. They are going to healthy people, and those with adjuvants, we need to have good adjuvant safety profile. And regulators and the WHO will be looking for that. But all COVID vaccines must gain acceptance from the community. Having a combination COVID flu, for example, rather than concomitant would make sense. Having annual vaccination would also make sense, biannual for those at higher risk. mRNA adverse reaction issues need to be monitored, and the same for the protein vaccines. They may well be safer, but there might be issues there too, and we need to keep an eye on all of them. In the future, we're going to see more mRNA, more self-amplifying mRNA, and recombinant protein vaccines are almost going to be certainly the most successful platforms. There will be mild to adverse reactions. Those under 30 in particular should know the risks. Protein nanoparticle vaccines, I think, should be promoted for all adults, particularly younger adults. Personal view. We've seen a lot of intranasal and oral vaccines come into the research field, and they certainly produce a faster immune response, but they don't appear to be as efficacious. And there are gamma irradiated vaccines that seem to be very successful for pneumococcal at this stage, and announcements are being made this month, I believe, about those vaccines, and there will be some application for that platform as well for influenza and COVID. And I guess it's a matter of watching the research space, and also of using patches or maps. These might be possible approaches in the future, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I'd just like to finish with acknowledgements from the various organisations from where information was sourced. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gary. It's a great overview and update of COVID-19, including infection rates, the different variants, and the evolution of the variants and treatment options. We have ample amount of time for questions. Please have a go, but maybe I'll just start with one. A personal experience, I got my 5th dose yesterday, fifth booster dose, and I just had a quick note that the ATAGI booster advice for under 65 no risk patient is consider. So is that for me to consider? Because
Yes.
my GP did not mention anything about that I was low risk. All he asked was, when was your last vaccination and have you had COVID in the last 6 months?
Well,
So
both the WHO, yeah, look, both the WHO and ATAGI for healthy persons under 65, there's no recommendation to get the vaccine, in fact. But there is a recommendation, if you can call it that, to consider getting the vaccine if you wish. I personally would add to that if you're about to travel, it would make sense to get a vaccine because nobody wants to end up in a hospital overseas, for example, or nobody wants to ruin their holiday with serious illness. But there's no actual recommendation anymore for healthy persons without underlying conditions who are under 65 to receive a vaccine, not in Australia and not by the WHO.
we do have a have a go question. Is there evidence of antiviral resistance?
Very little. There's really no substantial evidence at all of antiviral resistance. So at the moment, I don't think we need to be concerned about that.
Is there any data or maybe have some personal experience with patients that are over 65 and they've had flu and COVID together? Is that a double whammy and how did they fare?
I haven't seen a lot of data on that. It's theoretically possible to get flu and COVID together, but unlikely. I think it's more likely you could have one after the other. It's pretty difficult to get two viruses at once for various immunological reasons, although it's possible. So I think that would be rare.
I asked the question just because Robert Boyd mentioned previously to me that there will come a time when there's an outbreak of both flu and COVID together, and that's just pending. Another question here, is there any comments about serology? If there is a place for the blood tests, if there is any reliability, and how long after infection could serology confirm infection?
I would think 7 days, but because I mean now we just do PCR tests, and serology is not really used as a diagnostic marker to confirm infection. Generally, you just go for PCR for the virus itself. But not a lot. I mean, there's serology done on the blood banks, as I showed you the data from England and Australia, and I think that data just shows clearly that nearly everybody in the community, 98% in the UK, have got antibodies to COVID-19, partly because of vaccination, but not everybody gets vaccinated. And antibody wanes, of course. So it's an interesting snapshot that at any one time, there appear to be 90 to nearly 100% of people that have got antibody. So people are obviously getting infected and reinfected, or they're getting one vaccination after another. But antibody doesn't last terribly long, at best for 5 months and probably more like 7 or 8 weeks. So I said before, immunogenicity isn't everything. And I wouldn't hang my hat on the serology at this stage for any diagnosis of COVID-19 or expectation of protection against infection.
Another question here about the future of COVID-19. In just your opinion, the variants, it's evolving. They're becoming, the disease burden is decreasing. Maybe the infection rate is increasing, but is there a point of time when the virus might do a U-turn and become not necessarily more contagious, but more detrimental to risk patients?
My personal view is it's really unlikely. I think we would have seen it by now. We've had a year and a half of Omicron just sort of quietly mutating away and doing its own thing and reassorting with itself, and producing a new one. So we've seen XBB arise. We still see a little bit of BA4 and 5 around. We'll see little recombinations and new viruses appearing. We'll see point mutations as well. But I think it'll end up being like OC43 and similar coronaviruses that end up being a common cold over time. And I think we're seeing that in action. We've seen Wuhan move to alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and many other iterations, epsilon and iota and so on, that have come and gone, haven't lasted long, a few months, 6 months at best. And now we've got Omicron, much milder, moving to far less severity, and now dominating globally. 100% is Omicron. Don't really see any of the others. And now we see BA.4/5 and various iterations of them dominating, and all the others have now disappeared. And people stirred up a lot of fear about the other iterations that came along. All of it unjustified, and we have to get out of that cycle of fear and panic, but also be careful not to move into the cycle of neglect. We still need to keep an eye on these variants for sure. And of course, you can't say it won't happen. Reassort with, say, another animal virus, but it's not like flu where this happens between the animal and human world. Is far less likely to happen from bats to humans than it is, say, from bird life and pigs to horses to humans, as we've seen in the past with pandemic influenza viruses.
We have a question here from Claudio. Is a single risk factor such as obesity support the need for booster 4 and 5 in persons under aged 65?
Look, I think it is. I mean, obesity came through as a really big risk factor, apart from age. So I think if you have obesity, serious obesity, then you're definitely at risk of serious disease or hospitalization. I don't think there's any question about that. And, it obviously patient-doctor interaction, the advice to lose weight really does make sense from the point of view of viral infections in general, but particularly COVID. Obesity is definitely a risk factor for serious disease.
Yes, there's a few other risk factors. We've got a webinar at the end of this month on cardiovascular disease and reducing the cardiovascular disease risk of death by 50% through flu vaccination. So that's another risk factor. So is there any evidence of co-infection with other circulating viruses?
Well, I mean, sometimes you see co-infection with adenovirus and enterovirus, adeno-associated viruses. But we carry viruses. 10 to 20% of the population carries a virus asymptomatically. Generally, they're adeno, entero, or herpes viruses that we just carry anyway. Coronavirus is not going to reassort with those in any way, so there's no issue with that. But it's quite rare to see two viruses infect the same system, say the respiratory system, because of the immunological response and tremendous production of interferon. So it's quite rare to see that happen. Can happen, but incredibly rare. I don't expect it to be an issue. We will occasionally be able to isolate other viruses that we might normally carry, particularly adeno and enteroviruses.
So have a go with some more questions. We still have something like 6 or 7 minutes left. I looked at some data the other day. For the over 65s, the vaccination rate for 2 doses, I think it was around 40%. That's the highest vaccination rate in those groups of patients. Do we need to do more, or should we be satisfied with that?
No, I think people need at least 3 doses. I think 2 doses is a little bit of a failing. I'm surprised to hear that. I thought it was higher than that. But then again, I live in the ACT where I think 97% of people have had 3 doses. So it's that surprises me if it's only for 40%. That would be, to me, too low. I think people over 65 need 3 doses and should consider a booster, at least 1 booster every 6 months. And that certainly is the ATAGI recommendation as well.
Again, if anyone wants to ask a question, have a go. We've still got a few minutes left. Maybe I'll ask one more questions around rat tests. I've got a lot of them in my cupboard still, brought home from the children from school. You've touched upon this already, and I might be asking a question that you've already actually provided the answer to. So how accurate are these rat tests in a symptomatic patient when it says negative, but you've got some, pretty strong indicators of, say mild temperature and sore throat? Should you just ignore that rat test or wait for another rat test the next day, or just go and get a PCR test?
No, look, if you're serious about it, you go and get a PCR test, because that's quite definitive and that's clear. The rat tests are useful, but really only if they're positive and if they're done well, and if they're reported to somewhere, and they're not, and if people take responsibility, which many don't. Because of the cycle of neglect that's coming in, often the attitude is, and I've heard this too often from people, is, well, yeah, I was positive, but nobody cares anymore, so I went to work anyway. And, this, of course, then helps spread the virus, and then other people get infected, and they may or may not come down with a serious illness. So we do have to be careful of the cycle of neglect, and I think rat tests inadvertently can add to this. Whereas as a PCR test, it's up to us and it's up to frontline workers to say to their patients, including pharmacists and others, that take responsibility. If you're positive, stay home until you're negative. But even a rat negative test isn't definitive. You might well be negative at day 7, but at day 8, you're still carrying the virus. So it really is only a PCR test that gives you a definitive answer if you're going to take COVID-19 seriously and make sure you don't spread it to other people. So isolation is important if you're positive by a rat, and certainly really important if you're positive by PCR, which is the only definitive test. So you might have plenty of rat tests in the cupboard, just watch the expiration date, and as the virus changes, they become less effective anyway, whereas a PCR test won't.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. We've got just a couple of minutes. I think I might wrap up. I'm very keen to finish on time. People have got families and dinner to consume and things like that, or cook and consume. So Prof. Groman, I'd just like to thank you for your presentation. Very detailed, specifically in the area of infection rates and treatment options, and how the variant is evolving. I would just like to finalize a few things to say that we have got another disease education webinar coming up on the 7th of June. That's pneumococcal disease. You'll be able to find the details and register online as of probably about next Wednesday. If you look on our website, there's going to be quite a few updates on that, so that's a good one to look for. As I said before, we've got other non-accredited and CBD accredited webinars or activities for GPs online, so you're welcome to go and have a look at that. Also, to subscribe to the Immunisation Coalition newsletter, we send that out either on a daily basis or weekly basis, so if you subscribe to us, we'll send that out to you. And an evaluation form will be sent out to you, and you'll probably see that in your inbox tomorrow morning. It only takes a few minutes, and it's really to provide us feedback for continuous improvement. So we're always looking to improve the activities that we provide to you. So in saying that, thank you again, Gary, for your presentation. Thanks everyone for participating. And I would say good evening and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.